Welcome everybody to Michael Ventura. The title of this is called Applied Empathy, Leading with Understanding. Michael Ventura is an acclaimed entrepreneur, practitioner, lecturer, and author. For over 12 years, he served as the founder of CEO Sub Rosa, but I don't think you're doing that anymore, right?
Nope.
Yeah. That was his history anyway. It's like your bio. A strategy and design firm that worked with some of the world's most influential organizations, like Google and Microsoft. And then alongside his work, Michael has spent more than a decade working in private practice with individuals seeking support through the indigenous medicine practice grounded in the traditions of the Nauvoo people. I think I said that right. Is that right? Close to
Nawa.
Nawa people. His book, Applied Empathy, published by Simon & Schuster in 2018, explores the intersectionality of these two worlds, business and well-being, through the practice of empathy for yourself and for others. Well, Michael, I'll let you take it away, and we'll come back around 10 of, and if you have some time for Q&A or however it works, we're here for you.
That sounds great. Thank you, everyone, for joining. I'm excited to share some of this work and some of this thinking with you over the next hour. Before I share my screen and go into some of the slides that we're going to watch and talk through, I'd just like to ask everyone if you could just take a moment and think about your personal definition of empathy. And if you have a pen and paper and you want to write it down, write it down. If you just want to think it, that's fine too. But empathy is one of those words that we all say, but we all have slightly different definitions for. So I'd just like you to take 15 seconds and get what you perceive empathy to be down right now. So I'll give you a couple seconds. Now, what I'm going to ask you to do for the next 50 minutes or so is to just suspend that definition. You don't have to erase it. You don't have to forget it, but I'm going to ask you to just be open-minded to exploring how that definition might get more nuanced, perhaps broader, as we go through some of the thinking that I'll share with you today. And by all means, please drop questions into the chat if you have questions. I really do want to make time at the end to be able to have some dialogue with folks. So if anything is confusing or you want to go into a little more detail or it just sparks something for you that you want to share, feel free to drop it in there. Bear with me 1 minute. I'm going to share my screen. Okay. So, as I said, suspend that definition and away we go. The first thing I tell people when we talk about empathy is it's not about being nice. This is a really important aspect of this because when most people hear empathy, they think it's synonymous with being nice. And niceness, sympathy, compassion, those are all great things. I want those things to happen in the world just as much as you probably do. But those are side effects of empathy. They aren't empathy unto itself. And so it's important to know that as we go in, that these are not the same thing. But before we talk about what empathy is, we're going to talk a little bit about why. Why was empathy such an important thing for me? Why have I written a book on this and built a career around helping organizations and individuals and leaders and people really embrace this idea of empathy? And for me, it was because my whole career has been spent in the services business in one way or another, whether it was as a consultant, as a coach to leaders, as a facilitator, as a practitioner of alternative medicine. In all of these traditions and all of these different ways I've applied my trade, the thing that I found that what made my work most effective was when I was practicing empathy, when I was perspective taking. And that's a key phrase, perspective taking. It's something that I'm going to say time and again as we go through this, because the act of perspective taking, of getting out of your shoes and standing in the shoes of another or something like that. I'm sure many of you, when you thought of your definition, used words or phrases like that. That's a very important component of empathy, but it's not all there is to empathy. But what I will do is as we go through this journey, you'll see some of the ways I've thought about how to expand that definition, how to build some practices and tools and resources around it so that it can be more effective for you in the work you do. So it's important to know and remember that empathy is a human characteristic. It's something we all have. Sometimes people talk about empathy like it's some special gift. Like, oh, that person has it and I don't have enough of it. And maybe if I worked harder, or maybe if I was born different, I'd have more of it. It's not that. We all have the capacity to practice empathy. And I like to think about empathy like a muscle. It's a muscle we train. The more we exercise it, the more we work with it, the more we actually make it a part of our day-to-day, the more effective we become, the more useful it is to us and the work we do. But like any other muscle, if you don't work it, if you don't practice with it, it's going to atrophy. And you're not going to be as strong. You're not going to be as nimble. It's not going to come as natural to you. But just remember that you all have the capacity to practice this. And it's also important to note that empathy is more varied than we often think. There's actually 3 types of empathy from a clinical psychology standpoint. So the first is affective empathy. And affective empathy I think of as sort of like golden rule behavior. So let's say I walk into a room and I see you across the room and we know each other. We've been friends for a while. And so based on your facial expression and your posture and some other things that I'm picking up from across the room, I get the sense that you're sad. And so I say to myself, practicing effective empathy, well, what would I want if I was sad? I'd probably want to be consoled. So I walk across the room and I put my hand on your shoulder and I say some comforting words. And it doesn't work out. In fact, you turn to me and you say, thanks, Michael, I really appreciate that, but I just want to be left alone right now. And this isn't helping. And so I walk away saying, wow, that's so strange because I was trying to practice empathy. I did what was right for me. If I was in her shoes or his shoes, if I was feeling sad, this is what I would want. So why didn't it work? Well, it didn't work because effective empathy carries with it our own inherent bias. It's what would I want in your shoes. It's what I would do in this circumstance. And what I would do is not what you would do every time, right? We're different people. We want different things. So effective empathy is not always right, but it is the most common form of empathy. When we've been taught empathy over the years, we've thought about it like this. We have to embody something else and we have to get into someone else's shoes and do what we would do if we were in their situation. Doesn't always work that way. Second type of empathy is somatic empathy. This is the physical feeling of the emotions or the experience of someone else. Doctors, especially young doctors or young medical professionals, often suffer or go through some sort of challenge that is akin to empathy burnout at some point because they're just taking on so much from everyone else around them. A good example that probably most of you have had at some point in your life is when you see someone else accidentally slam their hand in a door or a drawer and you wince just for that split second. It's happening to you until you realize that, no, that wasn't me, but I've been there too. And so you have this somatic empathy. You have this physical feeling of the emotion. And then you realize that actually isn't. That's just a mirror neuron thing happening where you've been there before. So it calls that back up for you. Hard to train. Not necessarily going to make anyone a better leader, better partner, better collaborator, and not really something we're going to talk much about today. Third type of empathy, cognitive empathy. This is where I really get excited because cognitive empathy is the type of empathy that I think opens the door to really building a practice and a skill set around empathy. And so I think of cognitive empathy as platinum rule instead of golden rule. And what I mean by that is not to do what you would want in someone else's shoes, but to do unto others as they would have you do unto them. Right? So going back to that example, I walk into that room, I see my friend across the room, they look sad. What I might want is to be consoled, but maybe what I need to do is to walk over and say, hey, you seem sad. Are you sad? Yeah, I'm not having a great time right now. Is there anything I can do for you? I would really just like to be left alone. Okay, no problem. And I walk away. See, the challenge with cognitive empathy is it's harder because it has 2 things that it's going to make you do. First, it's going to make you inquire, right? And sometimes we don't, as humans, like to ask tough questions. Sometimes tough questions are difficult to come up with or to ask or to receive responses to. So we don't want to have those conversations. It's easier to just infer or assume what you think someone would want versus having the conversation sometimes. And the second thing it makes us do is it makes us sometimes change behavior. Do something that they would want, even though it's not maybe what you would want. And most people don't like to change their behavior. Most people like to do things the way they like to do things. And so we often revert to practicing effective empathy because it's easier, but it's not always right. But getting into that cognitive empathy space, being able to inquire and behavior change on the fly so that you're actually meeting someone where they are and responding to their needs, that's where the magic really happens. And so I call applied empathy self-aware perspective taking to gain richer, deeper understanding. That first clause, self-aware perspective taking, is not something you often see when you think about empathy. Usually when we think about empathy, we think about empathy for someone else, right? But with this, I like to think that we are with ourselves 24 hours a day. We can practice that self-observation, that understanding of our unconscious bias, that understanding of those patterns or behaviors that might be holding us back or might be preventing us from actually connecting with that person in the way they need us to. And so that self-aware bit is a way to turn that empathy lens inward in order to learn about what's preventing us from that true, deeper, more meaningful connection with someone else. And when we learn that work and we can adjust around it and compensate for it and overcome it or change our own behaviors or our mindsets, then we become more deft, more capable practitioners of empathy. But why do we need to apply it? It's called applied empathy. We've been talking so far about empathy. What's the applied part all about? Well, the applied part is because empathy unto itself is neutral, particularly cognitive empathy. If I spend the next 15 minutes...
Hearing a lot of talking in the background.
Oh, someone off mute? I'm not hearing it, Ken, but I'll just keep going. If anyone has their microphone unmuted, if you would just mute it, that'd be helpful. So why do we need to apply it? Well, we need to apply it because the practice of empathy in and of itself is going to be neutral. It's what you do with it that matters. But it's important to note that because it's neutral, I could ask you a bunch of questions. You could give me a bunch of answers. But if I'm not going to change my behavior and change my mindset, it doesn't matter. So it's the practice of putting that into action that brings it into the world. But the important thing to remember is because it's neutral, you actually can see some people, particularly with cognitive empathy, use it for nefarious gains. Sociopaths are actually good cognitive empaths because they have to understand you in order to know how to manipulate you. And so I always say that in this talk because I want people to know that when you practice empathy, true, meaningful, real, heart-centered, trying to connect with someone else empathy, it comes with a code of ethics. What are you going to do with that information? Are you going to be ethical about it? Are you going to let me know that you're gathering this information, that, hey, I'm investing in you. I'm asking you these questions because I want to know you better, because I want to make sure that our partnership is stronger, because I want to learn what I'm doing wrong to make sure that we can actually work better together, whatever it is, right? But you build that tacit agreement with someone so that that information gathering, that behavior change that you're about to embark on is done transparently and for the greater good of both of your relationships. But it's not easy. This is probably the most important slide in the whole presentation, in my opinion. Empathy takes work. It takes time. It will slow things down before it speeds them up. Sometimes you're going to have to do stuff you don't want to do. But if you stick with it, if you practice it, it gets easier, it gets more comfortable, it becomes more second nature. And that's really the goal of this work. But are you willing to address what comes up? Earlier, we talked about that self-aware aspect, right? So sometimes practicing this is going to point at things within you that might need to change, that might need to evolve, that might need to be seen from a different lens. And so one of the ways that I like to start this work is by starting with ourselves. And so there's a little framework here that I'll share. This is about seeing things in context. So I use the metaphor of climate and weather here. And the way I'll describe it is, I live in New York City, and in New York, we have a pretty predictable climate on a year-over-year basis. What we get is about 5 months of winter. It's usually pretty cold, have a couple snowstorms. Then we'll get 2 months of spring. It's super wet. It rains almost every day. It's still pretty chilly. And then in the blink of an eye, it's summer, and it's 100% humidity, and it's hot, and it's sunny, and it's beautiful. And then we get about a week to 2 months of a fall at the end before the cycle repeats itself. And that's the way it's been for as long as I've been here 40 years, and this is the way the climate operates here, right? What's your climate? What are the predictable patterns inside you? What are your beliefs, your fears, attitudes, habits, the things that make you foundationally who you are, the stuff that would be tough to change, right? That's your climate. Whereas we also, on a day-to-day, minute-to-minute basis, encounter weather. Weather's transient. It's circumstantial. It's based on relationships, events, cycles, things like that. It passes in and out all the time. Today it rains, tomorrow it's going to be sunny, right? What's the weather happening in your life right now? And how is that weather affecting you? So when you run into a conflict with someone, when you're having a difficult time understanding them, empathizing with them, I find this to be a very helpful tool because you can zoom out and you can say, is what we're encountering a climate issue? Are we fundamentally different people? Do we have different beliefs, different attitudes, different ways we see the world? Or are we actually pretty aligned there? And it's actually this weather, this externality, this third thing that's affecting us, and we're responding to it in different ways. And that depersonalizes a lot of the stuff that we often butt up against when we're having challenges with other people. Because now what we're observing is our climate, our innate sense of self, and that person's innate sense of self, or the weather, the thing that's kind of messing with us right now. And then we can talk about it. We can say, you know what? We are different people. We have a different belief system. Let's talk about this. Let's see where we can meet in the middle. Where do our beliefs actually overlap, if at all? Let's talk about that. Or, you know what? Like, you and I were pretty similar. We got a lot of the same things going on, but we're reacting to this thing very differently. Why do you think that is? Let's talk about it. Let's try to understand that better together so that we can collaborate. And all of a sudden, you're not talking about me and you. We're talking about this, talking about this circumstance, the context that empathy is occurring within. And so one way that I have helped to kind of map that out for folks at times has been to use this framework that I call the whole self. And the whole self looks across 7 aspects of the self. And in developing this, we've looked at everything from the chakras to the dantians to Maslow's hierarchy of needs to all sorts of different mind, body, spirit mapping methodologies in order to see, how do we break up the self into parts? How do we observe and have empathy for facets of ourself? So, for example, the physical self. I'm going to go through each of these, maybe for about 10 to 15 seconds. And I want you to try to not just hear it, but actually process some of it. Try to actually tune into yourself as we talk about each of these different selves. So the physical self, I'd like you to just sit up nice and straight in your chair. I'd like you to put both feet on the ground if you can. If you're sitting cross-legged, just kind of get your base and your roots really kind of stable. And I want you to take one really slow, deep breath, inhaling for at least 7 seconds. Really feeling your lungs expand. When you get to the top of your breath, hold it for at least 7 seconds. Really kind of just feeling the air in your lungs. And then slowly, patiently, exhaling for more than 7 seconds, maybe 10 seconds. Really nice, slow, metered exhale. Now ask yourself, when's the last time you took a breath like that? For some of you, it might have been earlier today, right? Maybe it was in a morning yoga practice you have or something like, or a meditation. But for some people, for a lot of people, they're not really in touch with their physical self. They're not paying attention to their breath, to the food they're putting in their bodies, to making sure that they're getting the right amount of sleep and exercise and all of those things. I did this workshop a few months ago. And when we did this one, someone said to me afterwards, I don't think I've ever taken a breath like that. I've basically just been panting my way through the last 20 years, just running from one meeting to another, to one task to another. And I've never really slowed down and taken a breath like that. And I realized how rare that was for me, right? For others, maybe you're really in touch with the physical self. That's great. You might have a less of an awareness for some of these other selves. The emotional self is another one. What is the most common emotion you've been feeling lately? Do you know what it is? Could you name it? Is it an emotion you want to feel? If so, what could you do to feel it even more often? If it's an emotion you don't want to feel, You can ask yourself questions like, well, where does it come from? Does someone trigger it, or is it coming from within me? What is the emotion I'd want to trade it for? How could I get there more often? Really understanding the emotion. What's making us tick inside our body? What's the emotion that's driving our day-to-day behavior? The inspired self. What gets you out of bed? What makes you excited about the work you're doing? Are you doing it enough? Are you feeling inspired? If you're not feeling inspired, what would you have to change to feel more inspired more often? Really understanding that drive, that motivator, that instinct to create and make and do and solve. The communal self. I think about this one sort of like a two-sided scale. Who is it you give the most of your energy to? And what is it they want? Right? So some people give a lot at work, and people want leadership or subservience or ideas, whatever it is. That's where it's coming out of the communal self. But then on the flip side, on the other side of that scale, what's refilling your tank? What community, could be one person, could be a group of people, puts the gas back into you? And what is it they give you? And I'm totally okay if those audiences are different. You might give a ton at work, but your family recharges you at home. That's great. What I care about is it balanced? Do you give this much and get this much? It's not sustainable, right? You can't go on doing that forever. You're going to burn out. And in the inverse, if you get a lot from people, but you feel like you're not giving enough, like you're not maximizing your potential, you're going to start to feel unfulfilled. You're going to start to feel like you're sort of lost or listless. So finding that way to make that equilibrium occur is really critical with the communal self. The intellectual self. If you were to take a snapshot of your life today, what are the things that you're working on intellectually? The relationships you're trying to deepen, perhaps the relationships you're trying to get out of, the skills you're trying to develop, the things you want to step away from, the things you want to step into at work, in your spiritual practice, in life, in your relationships, whatever it is. Really understanding that and being able to snapshot it and intellectualize it and articulate it and be able to revisit it in 3 months or in 3 years and say, where did I go from there? Did I make the right choices? Did I see a path, or was the path unclear? Did the path reveal itself over time? Really kind of intellectualizing that interior world. The mindful self, a lot of people talk about mindfulness, particularly in the business world these days. It has become in the past 5 to 10 years a topic that I hear daily. I often tell people, if you're interested in bringing mindfulness into your organization or into your teams, just start with presence. How often are you fully present with people? How often are you giving them your 100% attention, practicing active listening, really engaging with them, versus being on your phone or thinking about that meeting you just had or doing that thing you've got to do later now because you want to get it done so you get out the door faster, whatever it is, right? Just getting into the present. And then lastly, the aspirational self, big picture stuff. What are you doing? What are you going to use these short little years you get on this planet for? Life purpose. Do you know what it is? Are you doing it? What do you have to do differently to get there? And so you start to see, as we've gone through all of this, and if you've been playing the home version as I've done this, you've realized you've got ornate answers for each of these things. Now, just imagine every single person who's tuned into this talk, every single person that you work with, every single person you live with has their own ornate Byzantine answers to all of these things. And that to me is the biggest driver and the biggest motivator to practice empathy, because no one will ever know you as intimately as you know yourself. But if we make the effort to try to understand the complexity of someone else, to see what makes them tick, to ask more interesting questions, to pull out more meaningful answers, that's when we really build that connection, that empathic link that makes our relationships and our bonds stronger. But what about empathy for others? This has been a lot of inward. How do we go outward? How do we make sure that we're actually practicing this with other people? So this diagram is a quick one that I like to use to help people understand when a conversation goes awry, successful, doesn't matter. Every conversation you've ever had in your life, these 4 things have occurred. What you meant, what you said, what they heard, what they understood. Every conversation has had that. And so when something goes awry, you can take a step back sometimes and say, where did it break down? Did I know what I meant, but I said it the wrong way? Did I know what I meant and I said it the right way, but it wasn't the right time for them. They didn't hear it the right way because I sprung it on them, and we should have warmed up to that, or I should have made sure that we did it in a different way. Maybe we should have taken a one-on-one instead of sharing that with them in a group setting. Or maybe they heard it, but they didn't understand it. Maybe it wasn't put in context. Maybe it wasn't something that made sense to them the same way it made sense to you. So this is a quick little diagram, but it helps to, again, depersonalize things and help you get at an objective perspective of where the breakdowns in relationships, where the breakdowns in empathy might be occurring. And so one way that we can practice this with others and with ourselves is through a set of 7 archetypes. And each of these different archetypes are not in the same vein of a Myers-Briggs or a StrengthsFinder or something like that. I don't like to think of these as typing tools. I like to think of them as sort of gears in a car. That good empaths are actually really good at shifting between all 7 of these. They've got versatility. They've got that empathic versatility that to know that at certain times I need to shift into this one, and then later I might have to shift into this one. And it's all in the service of getting that deeper understanding that's really meaningful and important. So I'll just go through them very briefly. And as I do, make a note for yourself. What are the ones that sound resonant, that sound familiar? Those are probably ones that are innate in you. But don't presuppose that they're innate in everybody, because what's natural and comfortable for you might be very foreign and very different for someone else. And so you might need to sometimes shift out of your comfort zone and shift into a place that's maybe a little less comfortable for you in order to meet someone on their terms, in order to connect with someone more meaningfully. So in no particular order, I'll just start top left with the sage. The sage, be present, inhabit the here and now. The sage knows how to signal their presence, their whole investment in you and what's happening in the present moment. And that signaling tells the person on the other side that they're investing in me, that they care what I have to say. And so I'm going to share more. I'm going to share more authentically. It feels like a safe space to do so. And in doing that, the sage gathers understanding. They gather empathy. They get that perspective because that presence has engendered a sense of trust. The inquirer, great question asker. They know how to ask that question that unlocks that deeper, more meaningful truth. It's that real great question that opens up an hour-long conversation. That's what the inquirer is naturally good at. The convener, excellent host. They know how to create the circumstances where understanding can occur. So they're not just thinking about the person-to-person interaction. They're saying, well, at this dinner party, I know that these 2 people should really sit next to each other. And let's make sure the lights are a little lower so it just gets everybody nice and relaxed. And is it warm in here? Maybe we should cool the room off a little bit. Let's turn the air conditioner on, right? Like they're kind of setting the mindset and the settings, the set and setting for things to occur, for understanding to take place. The confidant, excellent listener. They practice active listening. They listen with their entirety as they're going through it. Not just like the sage who is really present and showing up for someone in order to engender that trust, but the confidant is really practicing this through the act of listening. The cultivator is a committer. I like to think of them as someone who has that telescopic vision where they can zoom out to the horizon and understand and have empathy for where we're going, what we're trying to accomplish, the goals and the place in the future we want to get to. And then they can pull back into the now and say, and based on that, here's what we're going to try to do. Here's what I want you to understand about these decisions we're making today, or this thing that you and I are going to do tomorrow in order to get there later. The seeker, daring, confident, unafraid, risk taker. They know what it feels like to come up to that threshold of change. They've probably done it many times in their life. They know that it's hard. They know that it's challenging. They know that it sometimes is backbreaking and emotional work to kind of undo and rebuild yourself from within. But that deep understanding from doing that for themselves can help them do that for other people. They can use that as a tool for understanding. That bridge building, that threshold crossing behavior actually helps them to understand each other. And the alchemist is an experimenter. They're a prototyper. They learn through the act of experimentation. So there's that old Thomas Edison quote that I can never remember accurately, but it's basically something like, I didn't fail at making a light bulb. I learned 500 ways to not make a light bulb. So alchemists learn through the act of experimentation. Failure is not failure to an alchemist. It's an opportunity to understand something more deeply. So within these, I'm sure you heard a couple that sound resonant and familiar. There's probably a couple that didn't sound so familiar too. Totally normal. True for most people. But pay attention to that. Notice where you're sort of playing to your strengths. Keep playing to them when it's appropriate, but also try to flex into some of those ones that feel a little less familiar, so you can start to build up that skill and that versatility that's so critical to being a well-rounded, empathic human. So I want to bring all this into practice and just talk it through with a case study. So this goes back to the time when I was running Sub Rosa, and we were working with a company called General Electric. I'm sure most of you know them. GE has a lot of different business units. One of the business units that they were having us take a look at was their medical imaging business. Excuse me. And within that, the medical imaging business, they were very much focused on the business of the mammography machine. They said, look, we're third in category. Our competitors sell more of these than we do. We want to grow our market share. We want to be a better, bigger business. But we think the unlock is going to come from empathy. So can you help us figure out what we need to be doing differently in our mammo business to drive growth? But there's one constraint. You can't change the machine because it's going to take too long. We're doing FDA approvals. There's all these other things that come along with changing the machine. We want to grow faster than it will take to change the machine and get it in hospitals operating at scale. So we have to figure out other ways to grow. And so we began by doing what we knew how to do well, which was to practice empathy. And so the first thing we did was we took a space. We actually built a physical space in New York City at retail level to conduct our research. We didn't go into some one-way glass room. We said, we're going to go into a shopping district in New York City at retail level. And we're going to put a sign up front in October, Breast Cancer Awareness Month. And we're going to invite in doctors, patients, cancer survivors, random people walking down the street shopping. And we're going to ask them to talk to us about women's health, about their fears, about what they're worried about when they go get a mammo. How might that change? What's the experience been like for you? And we designed a whole month of living, breathing research. We were practicing good conveners. We created the circumstance. We created the petri dish where all of this could occur. And then we also practiced good inquiry, right? Really using that inquirer skill. We knew the kinds of questions we wanted answers to. And when people came in, we were ready. We knew what we wanted to know. And we sat down and we gave them that warmth that they needed to be able to connect with us. And when they spoke, we were good confidants. We listened. They felt like they could trust us. They could tell us things they maybe hadn't told other people before. And that spurred deeper, more powerful conversations that helped us to understand their challenges even more. And practiced alchemy. The whole project was alchemy, really. It was all about experimentation. And everything was up on the walls. Everything was free for anyone to read. So someone could walk in off the street, and in fact, this happened. Someone walked in when we were having a brainstorm, not like this one, and someone walked over to one of those Post-it notes, and the Post-it note just said, waiting for the phone call. And the woman pointed to it, and she started to cry. And we stopped the brainstorm. We started talking with her, and she said, that's the worst part about this for me, is those days where I'm waiting for that phone to ring to tell me whether or not I'm going to have to go through cancer treatment again because I've been through it once before and I don't, and there was this whole story from one thing, from waiting to get a phone call. And we had hundreds of those little insights, those little things that made someone's personal experience really challenging and could probably be fixed if we just focused on them. I'm going to come back to those little insights in a moment, but I'm also going to talk a little bit about how we use the whole self, because it wasn't just the archetypes we practiced. So the physical self is obviously a very fundamental component of the mammo experience, right? Everyone says 87% of the women we talked to told us that the number one reason they don't get screened on a 12-month basis is the memory of pain from the last exam. 84%, very close second, said the second biggest complaint was the temperature of the exam room. Now, we can't change the pain because, as GE told us in the beginning, compression is the way the machines work and we can't change the machines. But could we change temperature? I'll come back to that in a moment too. But the physical experience was something we really dissected and tried to understand. The emotional self, the emotional experience, this is a very emotional process for many people. Just the appointment making can be emotional, or the day that you go in, or the day that you wait for the results, or the day you get results and maybe have to follow up with some other treatment, right? This is the whole journey. If it's not managed with a humane approach, can be very emotional for folks. And one of the things that people talked about with those emotions is sometimes when they're going through those emotions, they don't have a community around them that they can feel supported by. They feel alone. They feel like they've got to go this road by themselves. And so we started to look at, how do you build community? How do you make sure that there's a way to connect all of these people together so that they do feel supported, even if it's not from their immediate family, but in a way that they never feel like they're going it alone. And the aspirational self, this is a stock photo, but it's emblematic of a real story. The woman on the left was a woman who had recently had a kid, and we had been talking with her about this experience, and she said, I used to hate going to get a mammo because my mom had breast cancer and she survived. But I've always been worried that I would get it too. But now I have a little daughter, and I've been going to get my mammo now because I want to be alive and I want to be well and I want to be with her when she goes and gets her first one. And so her aspirations changed, her purpose changed, her higher order reason for being shifted as life events evolved for her. And so all of this is to say, we really spent time connecting and understanding and listening and absorbing all of this information from all of these different people so that we could derive these empathic insights. And so we went back to GE and we said, look, we don't think you should just be in the product business. We think you should be in the product and service business. You should be in the service of these patients. We should make a patient-first experience that designs everything differently. The gown, the appointment-making process, the turnaround time on results, all of those things that everyone complained about, what if we just fixed them? What if we just made them better? And GE, historically, that wasn't their business. Their business was make a machine, sell a machine to a hospital, then maintain the machine until they buy a new one. But then when we started to have that conversation, they realized there was a real opportunity, an opportunity to make a patient-first experience. And when we did that work, we brought people back. We had a 200-person group that we were testing this with. And we brought them back to Memorial Sloan Kettering, and we rescreened them under new conditions where their appointment process was nicer and more efficient. The gown they wore was different. The wait time for results was faster, and the temperature was warmer. We actually went really deep on this. We talked with GE. We understood why the rooms are so cold. Average temperature of an exam room is around 64 degrees Fahrenheit, which is cold, not to mention you're in that paper gown, right? But what would happen if we increased the temperature? And the engineer said, well, by how much? And we said, we don't know. We're kind of working this out with you here. What if we increased it by 8 to 10 degrees? What if we could get it to 72 to 74 degrees? Would that hurt the machine? Would that hurt the results? And they said, no, it's just not optimal, but it wouldn't hurt. But these engineers are not built to be designing human experiences. They're designing the machine. But no one along that journey ever asked that question. No one ever on that journey ever put themselves in the shoes of those patients and said, if we make it warmer, I bet people will be more comfortable. And so we increased the temperature of the exam room, and we brought people back and screened them under those new conditions. We learned two really interesting things. One, the complaint of pain was cut nearly in half on the second screening because people just were more comfortable and they were treated differently. And psychologically, that softened the blow of everything else that was going on. That wasn't the astounding finding. The astounding finding was that we were actually able to increase the efficacy of the test by over 10. Second time around. And we started to ask when we saw the results come in, what's going on? Why is this a more effective, more clear screening than the ones prior? And what we came to find was the warm temperature and the way people were being treated actually let their muscles relax, and they were a little more supple and a little more soft. And so when the compression flattened the breast tissue and the light traveled from the top and bottom panel and scanned for cancerous cells, it actually got the tissue thinner because people were more relaxed and calm. And so the machine actually performed better. And this blew our minds. And we realized in that moment that when you practice empathy, when you really get in and fix these things for people and understand what makes their experience unique and challenging, and you put your heart and soul and mind and capability into fixing them, you can actually affect real seismic change. So where do we go from here? First thing I'd like to say is that when we started this, I asked you to think about your definition of empathy. And I would wager, for most of you, you thought about being in the shoes of someone else or some other version of that phrase. But I hope by now what you've learned is that, yes, you can go into the exterior practice of empathy and see the world from someone else's eyes. You can also do the interior work, turn that lens inward and see what makes you tick, see what's going on the interior world of you. You can also have empathy for circumstances, right? You can look at what you've done in the past or where you're going in the future, and you can perspective take on that. You can see with that new perspective what might need to change, what might need to be different, how you might need to show up in a new way in order to affect the right kind of change in the world. And you can expect results, specifically from a business standpoint, because a lot of the organizations that I work with say, well, yeah, this all sounds great, but this is really soft. This sounds like touchy-feely stuff. And it is, but it is also real, pragmatic, effective work that can change people's businesses, relationships, teams, everything. And so decisions start to become more understandable and inclusive. You start to be able to see how the choices we're making are being informed by this understanding because we've had these conversations, because we've shared this information. This is why we're making these choices. And the culture of an organization starts to become more gelled, more collaborative. Teams also become more collaborative and productive. See the emergence of high-performing teams, that no-look-pass effect, right? That ability to know that this person operates this way and that person operates that way. And if I'm a good enough leader, I know how to shift between each of them and make sure that we get what we need from all of them in order to get the best result for this project. And that's true at work, but that can be true in relationships outside of the office too. You know the way some friends or family members operate. The more you know them, the more you know how to show up in a way that feels connected to them, that feels authentic, that feels aware of their needs and meets them on their terms when necessary. And organizations can also become more responsive and resilient. They're not just navel-gazing, kind of stuck in their own world. They're able to see outside their four walls. They're able to respond and be more nimble as the world changes. But it takes practice. As we said in the beginning, it's like a muscle you train. So the more you practice it, the more you put the effort in, the more resilient you'll be, the more capable you'll be, and ultimately, the more empathic those around you will feel and you will feel for them. And start with what you can handle. A lot of times people will say, what's a good way to start? A good way to start is to start with things you can affect, your first sphere of influence. And so one way I often tell people to get started, think about some of the more common, mundane questions you tend to ask people every day and see if there's a way to shift it to get to something a little more interesting, a little more meaningful, a little more deep. And so an example I like is, in those first few minutes of a conference call or a meeting when everyone's kind of sitting around waiting for the thing to start, and there's that little banter and everyone's saying, oh, how are you doing today? And you say the same thing you said 5 other times that day. Right? Oh, I'm okay. Yesterday it was raining and my kid had soccer practice and this and that. And you kind of just go into the same routine because you're used to it. It's a question you get asked often, so you give a response you give often. What if you change that question? Instead of saying, how are you today? What if you said, what's it like to be Michael today? I promise you. Try it tomorrow. Just try it with 1 or 2 people. Ask it that way. Say, what's it like to be Joe today? You will get a fascinating, 10 times more interesting answer from that person because it's not the way they're used to hearing it. And so they take it on with new ears. They hear it in a different way and they're going to give you something else. And that something else is likely to be more interesting than the normal rote answer that they're typically given. And now is the time. I think we all know we live in a world that is feeling more and more pulled apart and adversarial and in conflict with belief systems. And I am not here to say that empathy is going to cure all of that. It is not the silver bullet, but it is the start. It's a bridge building tool. It's a way to see that other person's view. And you don't have to necessarily get them on your side every time, but you can start to use those bridges to meet in the middle, to share some more of yourself, to understand a little more of themselves, to commit to some change, some growth, some evolution, so we can hopefully get to a better place together. So thank you. I appreciate you sharing some time with me and inviting me into this conversation. We've got about 12 minutes left. I'm happy to take questions. I'm going to stop sharing my screen. And Ken, I know you were kind of tracking the chat while we went. So if there were questions that bubbled up that you'd like to talk about, feel free to let me know and we can take it from there. But thank you all for your attention.
If anybody has any questions, please put them in the chat, or if you want to just unmute yourself and start chatting, you could do that too and ask your question. I'll ask one, Michael.
Yeah.
What is a good start for people when they're, they feel they don't have this gift of giving empathy, right? So they're just like, kind of like clueless. What's a good maybe place for them to start?
So I think, the person that is the easiest to practice with sometimes is also one of the harder ones, but it's yourself, because you're going to be with yourself 24 hours a day. I promise you that. And so it's sometimes a good place to start by turning that lens inward. I like journaling. I think journaling is a great tool for this, to be able to say, asking yourself questions like, what's going on in my interior world today? Can I get a snapshot, right? How does it feel to be me today? And then do that for 5 days and see how the answers are changing, right? And then start to take that apart. Almost sort of like treat it like you're a detective, right? Like, well, what was different on Wednesday? Because Wednesday I felt great, but then Thursday I had a horrible day, right? And you can start to observe that. Self-observation doesn't just have to be in the moment. It can also be chronological, and you can start to see how externalities. Maybe Wednesday was great because you were going to see your sister in the morning for breakfast, and it kicked you off on the day that you really wanted to have, as opposed to Thursday where you had to get a root canal, right? Whatever it is, right? Those externalities might be driving it, or it might be some interior thing that's happening. The other thing I'll say is, with other people, when you're practicing empathy, it's great to tell them that I'm working on this. Like, hey, I'm trying to get more empathic. I'm trying to learn how to be better at understanding other people. Help me understand you. One of the things that I have a colleague I used to work with, and it was one of the coolest things I ever saw when she started working with us on the first day of the job. She brought in a user manual for herself. And it said, here's how to work with me. I don't do well with brainstorms in the first couple hours of the morning. I feel like I got to check my email and get that out of the way before I can be useful. I really, first hour after lunch, I'm usually pretty great if you need to have a one-on-one, but I'm not good in a brainstorm with that. And she just had this stuff about herself, and people knew how to work with her instantaneously because she came in and basically said, "This is how I operate."
So journaling, and you come up with the same thing each day, and you just have a different, whatever you journal is going to be a little different how you feel for the day.
Yeah, exactly. And then after you get a couple entries in, you can start to see what's affecting those things.
Okay. Marjorie, do you have a question for?
Yeah, hi. I love that. I've always asked my daughter to write me a user manual. She hasn't done it yet. So I love that. And I love the whole concept of empathy. This is not at all intended to sound petty or semantic, but is there a difference between empathetic and empathic?
I love that you asked that question. Only in the eyes of the American Psychological Association. They prefer empathic, which is why I use it that way, because although I'm not a psychologist, a lot of the work that I've done has been informed by literature I've read in that space. And so I just use that, but both definitions are equally acceptable.
Thank you. That's bothered me for a while. Thank you.
No problem.
And so how can people get a hold of you, Michael?
So I am usually best found on social media. I'm quick and responsive on LinkedIn, on Instagram, on Facebook, on all those places. So I encourage people to just kind of track me down there. And then, of course, everything we just went through is in the book, Applied Empathy. So the way the book is designed is that there is some framework and sort of strategy or structural thinking at the beginning of every chapter. Then it's elucidated a bit more through an example or two, very much like the GE case. And then each chapter ends with exercises, which is the really important part of this, is that at the end of a chapter, if something struck you and you're like, that's really cool, I'd like to try that a little more, there's going to be some stuff you can do. So it functions a bit as a workbook too. And so I think if this is something that's piqued your interest and you want to try it a little bit more, that's a great place to start. I do see Linda's question about narcissists, and I do want to hit on that because I think it's an important one. How do you deal with narcissists? How to not get blindsided, or what to do when emotionally triggered? Three kind of different questions in there, but I'll try to round it out. So when dealing with someone who can't see the issue because they're blinded by their own perspective and are not really great at getting out of their own shoes, and so narcissists are a great example of that. One of the things that you have to try to work extra hard to do is to not be emotionally triggered by that, and to acknowledge that that's a situation that you can't necessarily change, right? That's the way they are. But what you can do is start to work at understanding what their motivators are. What would it take for you to want to understand or be understood better? And so when you start to frame questions like that, you don't say, hey, look, I know you're a narcissist and I'm just trying to understand you. But you could say, look, I'm working harder because I really want to make sure our relationship gets better. And one thing I'd love to know is what makes a good relationship work in your world, right? Having those good questions that give them the prompt to be able to share what makes them tick will give you at least a little more of the tools and resources to know how you might need to show up differently in order to build a better relationship with people like that.
Nice. That emotionally triggered one that's a tough one, because triggers that we're all triggered from past lives, childhood.
Absolutely, yeah, and it changes as you change too. Like what triggered you a decade ago probably doesn't trigger you anymore. It might be something else, and so you've got to be vigilant and observing sort of what are those things that are coming up for you now, and those are always a good indicator that there's good work to be done.
You got to put the work into it. I think it sounds like more like you have to do it yourself first. It's kind of like you can't change somebody else, you change yourself, and then you see how they change just by you changing yourself.
I totally agree. I think, just take the example, and sadly, many people, given what's gone on in the past year with COVID, have experienced this. If you've never experienced deep personal loss, if you haven't lost a loved one before, and someone that just has, you've probably, when you've tried to console them or be supportive to them, felt a little inept because you've never been there yourself. It doesn't mean what you did for yourself when you lost someone needs to be the same, but you have a different perspective on the depth and the complexity of the experience. And so you can show up in a different way. And so I like to think the more you work on yourself and the more you move those boulders and confront those challenges, the easier it will be to help show up for others and help them tackle those challenges as well.
Beautiful, beautiful. Does anybody else want to ask Michael a question before we end the session? Sort of last chance here, guys. And if not, I'll just kind of give a little what's coming up at 6 o'clock. We got the Saturday Night Live, the Global Peace Tribe. That's on the schedule. You can sign up to attend that show. It's been going on since, I think it's March. Yeah, March. And then there's the Jan Robinson Networking. That's for 2 hours, 6 to 8. The Global Peace Tribe Alive is 6 to 9. So those two things. We've got Ansha speaking at 6 o'clock, and we have and Udo, the founder of the flaxseed oil, is coming up on the main stage at 6 o'clock. So stick around and make sure you visit the booths. They help support the show, as everybody does, and that you have. Greatly appreciate everybody's attendance, and just have a wonderful night. Make the best of it and have a lot of fun.
Thanks, everybody. Thank you, Ken.